Well, fans, round 2 of the 2016 candidates is now in the books. Peter Svidler and Veselin Topalov had, I don't want to say a game with no real fighting chances, but it was a Berlin, it was a little boring, and I'm going to break down why both myself and commentators are sometimes critical about the boringness of the Berlin when we talk about the structure, so stick around for that. They drew their game, of course. The other game between Levon Aronian and Vishy Anand was much more dynamic, though it also eventually ended in a draw. Levon Aronian had some pressure, but after accurate defense by the former world champion, both sides praising the other person's play in post-mortem, we saw the game peter out to equality. The saddest blunder of the tournament so far was played by Hikaru Nakamura after defending the worst side of a Queen's Indian and having a structurally much worse position potentially with an isolated d5 pawn. Hikaru held on and was maybe headed toward a drawn endgame, or at least a position with very decent drawing chances, until he made a dubious calculation and unnecessarily sacrificed a piece with 29 knight takes g3. Finally, our game of the day was between Fabiano, Caruana, and Anish Giri. They actually repeated the moves from the game of the day of round 1 in their 4d3 Berlin, with Caruana choosing 12 queen to b3 rather than Vishy's a4 idea. The variations that proceeded were really complex, very forced. Thank God we have MVL on the case as far as analyzing every one of our game of the day when it comes to posting his analysis in Peter Docker's news report, and then me stealing that information that I get to pawn off as my own thing here in these videos. So if you haven't seen MVL's analysis of the game of the day, check out both round 1 and today, as it is now posted. So let's dive right in without any further ado into Svidler's matchup with Veselin Topalov. And as we said, it was a Berlin, so we can jump through the first few moves of the opening without much mystery there. Of course, d3 is the move that these days is just what most people are crossing their fingers and hoping for when we see a Berlin, because it is leading to some really dynamic play for both sides, and we're seeing points scored, as we saw yesterday again by Anand and almost today by Caruana. But no, Castles was played, and not only that, when Svidler played Rookie 1, I learned, after studying his games in the database, that probably I shouldn't have been that surprised. He hasn't played the Dr. Evilfinger's main line of the Berlin d4 in a few years, according to the database I have. So Rookie 1 seems to be his variation of choice, and after these forced lines, what we have here is a position that, if Black wants to have some fighting chances, Veselin could have played knight f5, and I want to say that delicately because it's really not that much more aggressive than the variations we're going to see in the game where Black initiates the trade on e5. But the point is, if Veselin wanted a little more fight, maybe he could have played this. But after knight takes e5, as I promised, I'll explain why commentators look at these positions and we're a little critical. Of course, they're very strong grandmasters and have the right to play whatever position they want, but as fans, the thing is that these lines of the Berlin just offer very little in terms of a struggle. You're looking at structures that are completely symmetrical, and though pawn play is not going to be the ultimate decider, of course anyone can blunder tactics with a piece too, the plans that are developed at a high level are always about taking advantage of something that's permanently weak in your opponent's position and that they can't really do anything about. That's why you see imbalances in Queen's Indians or Nimzo Indians of double pawns versus bishop pair, or isolated pawns versus square control. Those are dynamic imbalances where there's a little more room to outplay the other in their evaluation and approach of weaknesses that aren't just totally static. Here you have literally a 7-pawn versus 7-pawn structure with almost nothing to play for, and that's why these Berlins are sometimes a little boring. And so, after some natural developing moves, which was all pretty much theory until about, I believe, this moment here with bishop to b4, Topalov trying to maybe put an awkward question to the rook. Will it misplace itself before I recapture on d5? Kind of a high-quality intermezzo. Or is white just going to invite more trades? Svidler voted for the latter, and after some even further exchanges, what we learned in the postmortem was that this position had been prepared by Veselin pretty much all the way out to here. And he revealed some of his lines. You never wonder sometimes if these guys are trying to intimidate their opponents for future rounds. But he said that he had prepared with a3, and after a4, he proved that Black's c-pawn was not really going to be that big of a weakness. After pieces are traded on e5, that basically white can't go after the c6 pawn without dropping the e-pawn, so essentially Black finds equality in these lines as well. Svidler wasn't interested in that anyway. He just played a4 instead of a3. And after the variations we see ensue, we have, again, just a bunch of weak pawns for both sides, where the most likely result will be that they get traded, and Bob's your uncle. That's exactly what we had, with the players agreeing to a draw in this final position. No real weaknesses to speak of, kind of like how we just started out with the Berlin. And so a little bit of a peaceful game there, maybe a rest day chosen by these guys on a day that's not a rest day if you ask me. But either way, let's move on to our second game between Levon Aronian and Vishy Anand. Now, of course, though we've seen ourselves a Queen's Gambit decline / semi-Slav transpositions with Aronian and Anand playing each other many times before, I'm never really disappointed. Of course, everyone remembers that brilliant novelty by Anand over Aronian in Wyken Z 2013. Probably preparation that he didn't get to use against Carlsen from their World Championship match. So these two guys never seem to disappoint, at least as far as I'm concerned. Some exciting moves always played. After D takes C4, noted in the analysis that I submitted to the games I reviewed for Peter Dogger's news report was that Bishop to E7, of course, played yesterday, would have transposed into potentially the game between Giri and Aronian. But that was not to be the case. Vishy wants something a little more exciting. He takes on C4. After E3, we see our first kind of fun move of the day, B5. Nothing like putting a pawn on pre and saying, come get me, big boy. But in all seriousness, this move has been played before. The intentions are very clear, right? I'm trying to overprotect my C4 pawn and maybe call your bluff with some dynamic, risky play in the process. White says, well, I'll take that pawn, and after bishop b4 check, I'm going to defend with the knight on d2. What's the advantage of defending with the knight on d2 versus retreating this knight? Well, the main one is obvious. If you put the knight on d2, you still have a threat, and that, of course, is to take on c7. Some variations that I analyzed noted that one of the recent games was actually played by Polish Grandmaster Wojtaszek, who was formerly a non-second in this line, and he had the white pieces against Grandelius. You never really know if the second's preparation is affecting a game, but I like to look for mystery, and I think that maybe Wojtaszek's approach or an improvement that wasn't found later on, maybe that had something to do with Vishy's play, I'm not sure. But Aronian wasn't interested in repeating what Wojtaszek did anyway to show that game, just to prove that we did do the preparation I'm talking about. After knight to c3, that game between Wojtaszek and Grandelius went just like this. I believe it was from Gibraltar this year, and again, the position was about equal. A similar structure, kind of like the game that was reached, but that was the line that was played there. In this game, of course, Levon, he wants more. He plays knight to d2, and after knight to d5, a very nice move that gains a tempo on the bishop and defends c7, if we're trying to keep track of the tactics. We see some natural developing moves, and bishop a6, knight to c3 with c5. What happens here was all pretty much theory until we get to the point of after knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop takes c5. This was still theory, actually, according to my analysis. Perhaps the move that last left the roads most traveled was here when Anand chose to take on c3. As I noted here in my variations, I can see now kind of our first officially original move. It may have been played otherwise, but the last time this was played, at least between really strong players, Boris Gelfand and Grachev, the game went bishop takes c5, knight takes d5, and after the c4 pawn was goggled up, we see black get a decent amount of compensation for the sacrificed pawn. White has a 2-on-1, but there's real pressure here and potentials of discovered checks and weirdness. So Aronian didn't want that. Whether it was preparation or not, he decided nay. And neither did Anand. After d takes c5, Anand, as we said, chose to take on c3 and then gobble c5, the advantage being pretty obvious. Here you're not losing the c4 pawn, at least not right away. And black appears to have equalized. Vishy has early control over the d-file, a tiny lead in development if you want to say that black has castled and white hasn't. So probably the position is about equal. But with some nice subtle moves here by both players, we're going to see where the tension begins. Knight f3, queen to g6, queen to d2. At first seems a little awkward for Levon to put the queen on what is clearly going to be a very challenged space of the board. That d-file is going to be fought after, and sometimes you don't want Her Majesty leading the way. And Anand plays a really interesting move here, bishop to b5, which threatens to play bishop a4, kick the rook off the file, and then take control over those critical squares. I admit, when I first saw this position live at Chess.com, I was actually thinking that Anand was on on track here. I thought the position looked dynamically almost favoring black with threats of bishop a4, and I thought black was for sure going to get the d-file. But here comes Levon, surprising everybody in a move that Anand praised after the game. Queen to e1, exclam a viach, right? He clears the d-file. As I said, it's not Her Majesty's job to lead the way. And in doing so, allows white to focus on the plan that white needs to focus on, which is find some way to put pressure on this c4 pawn. And with immediate threats like knight to e5 and putting pressure here, Levon does manage to grab a little bit of an edge, which, as you already know, as I said, the game petered out to a draw. But it was an interesting fight nonetheless. Now, noted should be that Anand can't play a move like f6 immediately to prevent knight e5. That's why queen e1 is so strong, because now knight d4 comes in, forking the e6 pawn and the bishop on b5, and if something like this occurs, which is a line that the computer kind of recommended for black once knight d4 is allowed, it's pretty clear that we like white for the long term in this game with the bishop pair and black having more weak pawns. So Anand, not interested in that, knew that he had no choice but to allow knight e5, and he played the move bishop to a4. Levon plays the critical move order, knight e5. Moving the rook would then allow this move f6, if you're wondering, which would stop knight e5. So Levon gets his tempos that he needs, and I'm not going to go into all the complicated variations that I analyzed for Peter Docker's news reports that could have occurred with queen c2, but let's just say both players were praising each other's play. They both thought the other chose the most accurate moves, and once the pieces got traded on the d-file, that was critical that Anand calculated this well, because he proves that even with the dropping of the c4 pawn, he is able to regain the material. If you want to pause the video and take a guess to see if you can play like the former world champion from India, go ahead and do so now. Okay, Vishy finds the most accurate way to regain material with bishop takes e3. One of the key points is that bishop takes e3. Of course, sorry, I have a lot of variations here, checking my analysis. One of the key points is the obvious one, that you unleash the rook to attack the undefended bishop. But even if a move like bishop takes e6 is played, the point is that black can take on f2 with check in a lot of positions and actually regain the pawn, because white will have just as many weaknesses left as black, including even taking here, where, again, the activity of black's pieces and the weakness of the c-pawn is probably going to be enough for black to draw. So because of that, after bishop takes e3, Levon chose not to just simply capture back, and in the game, we followed with... he did choose to capture back, but not in the complicated way with bishop takes e6. He played queen takes e3, and the variations that continued were, well, as Levon said himself, even though he knew this was headed for a draw, he didn't see anything better, so he went for it anyway. And that's exactly what we got here with a draw. Agreed, opposite colored bishops, and nothing much else to write home about. So I think the critical moment in hindsight was whether or not Anand achieved something with his preparation, maybe whether Wojtaszek's game had anything to do with it, and if Levon would repeat this. We see this nice maneuver, queen d2 to e1 and knight e5. A tiny bit of pressure didn't prove to be enough for Levon, so the draw was agreed. And with that, we're going to move on to our third game of today's review, and that is, of course, between Sergey Karjakin and Hikaru Nakamura. And, of course, as you can see from the title card here, we already know there was a result in this game, but as foreshadowed in my quick preview before the round, it was not necessarily because of a full or clean outplay from start to finish, more of a back and forth and eventually a sad blunder by the American. Here we have a Queen's Indian, no Nimzo, and after b6, g3, bishop a6, black is playing the most aggressive development of that piece rather than the bishop on b7. Hikaru Nakamura and Sergey Karjakin have both played this position many times, so you can look up those games in a database if you don't believe me. After check and then a retreat back to bishop e7 for amateurs not understanding why waste the tempo. One of the key things to understand is that the bishop on d2 is not necessarily ideally placed in what's going to happen in the center here. The bishop can both be blocking the queen, it can be blocking a natural square for the knight. So sometimes it's more about thinking about the bigger picture pawn structure and what is your plan, and less about the classical development of your pieces. So as you get better, you can remember that. Now, after theory ensues here, the first note I made in analyzing this game for Peter's report was that Karjakin was actually probably, if you wanted to look for a top grandmaster who's played this position many times as black recently, Karjakin's right there at the top of the list, though he chose to play c6 in all three of the recent games he had against Dingley Ren, Alex Onashuk, another American grandmaster, and I forget who the other one was. I think it was Elyanov. So, but Hikaru doesn't want that. He wants d5, a little bit more challenging. And what we've seen here ensue is actually still pretty much all theory. Queen c2 not quite as common as maybe rook c1, but they often transpose. Now, after the move rook to e8 and rook to d1, we see our first novelty. That was with knight to f8. The plan launched by Hikaru with knight f8 is certainly interesting. The idea is he wants to put the knight on e6, which both increases pressure to the d4 pawn, making it hard for white to do what he commonly wants, which is to move that knight to e5. But the knight on e6 also is a critical supporter of the c5 break. And one of black's main ideas or trumps in this position is at some point to break with c5, whether you take back on c5 with a piece and use the open file, but risk the isolated pawn, as happened in this game, or whether in some positions you take back with the pawn and try to play the two hanging pawn positions, but the dynamic advantage of the hanging pawns is at least they're together, right? If they're bad, misery loves company, and so by definition they tend to restrict more squares in the center than a lone isolated pawn, if I'm giving you the basic 101 things to think about. And so knight f8 was his plan there. Noted should be that bishop to b7, c6, I believe still. There are several moves that are still a little more common than what Hikaru did, but after knight f8, knight to e5 immediately, and then back to bishop e7, I think both sides thought they were still getting what they wanted. Because we know that Hikaru got the worst of things, it'll be interesting to see if he ever repeated this prepared novelty with knight f8, or if he goes for roads more traveled, which you could actually go all the way back to here and say that already instead of knight d7, rook e8, c6, and bishop b7 are all moves that are more commonly played than this early remaneuvering of the knight to the king side. So that'll be an interesting development to see if we see this again. I don't know enough about the lines, of course, to comment. These guys are way out of my league, but I can say that I'm going to guess that Hikaru wasn't happy with his position out of the opening given the way it happened, and it'll be curious to see if we see this again. Bishop to c1, a nice move that opens the d file, already making it harder to play c5 because I will open things up and go after your d pawn if I'm Karjakin. So black has to be a little patient, and after bishop b2, bishop d6, and e3, we get one of our first critical moments of the game. Hikaru was criticized and kind of criticized himself for playing a6 to slowly prepare the move c5, but one of the points afterwards is that he actually said he maybe thought he should have played c5 right away, but Karjakin revealed a very nice little line that starts with knight to c4, exclam, exposing the pawn to be pinned to this bishop. What's the reason? Well, the remaneuvering of this knight is threatening to win the bishop pair, and if the bishop retreats, we open things up, and probably this looks like a win of a pawn by force for white. The moves are very straightforward, very difficult for black to defend the d5 pawn, and some really tricky tactics that occur like this. Really fun to see that if the queen did move somewhere else, we might get a shake and bake over here on the king side, little discover checkmate attack. But in the end, we'll see that white was just up a pawn. So Hikaru kind of criticized his move a6, said he maybe should have played c5, but Karjakin looks like he had a very good approach prepared, which again is just more information for me to believe. I doubt we'll see this approach again by black. So again, after bishop d6, e3, so I went searching. If Hikaru thought that maybe he should have played c5, we see that he shouldn't. A6, not so good. I said, well, what should he have done then? Is c6 just the really sort of solid way that I've already mentioned black could have played a few times, the right way to go, and you just slowly build up to the plan that we know black wants? Or an interesting move, queen to e7, which, though the computers still give white a slight advantage, I suggested maybe this is an idea for black simply from the perspective that it removes the queen from the d file and prepares c5. I'm just being principled here. I'm not sure that, and now that I look at it, I wonder if knight to b5 doesn't try to win the bishop pair for white. So that maybe that's why Hikaru didn't do it. It was just my own suggestion. So back to the game. Hikaru played a6, and now the move knight e2 was played. And I actually did some analysis for like I said, the written word in Peter's report, and I think it's important for beginners to note that this is kind of an underrated but really strong move. It wasn't given any evaluation by the commentators, an exclam or interesting, but I think it's a very good move because it's important for players to understand whether or not their pieces are not only in good positions now, but are your pieces ideally placed for the pawn structure as it's about to change. And Karjakin, very clearly recognizes that the knight on c3 is not ideal. Despite putting pressure on d5, he actually wants this c file open. He wants the opportunity to bring this knight to f4, where it can gang up with the bishop on d5. And maybe, just maybe, if black takes back on c5 with a piece, I can use this square for my knight. So knight e2, not really given any marks, but in my book, it's a very strong move and just clearly anticipates that white's going to get an edge if black goes for the traditional move here, c5. But Hikaru didn't have anything better, so he went for it. He played c5, and as I said, we're going to get a position where now the clear weakness of the isolated pawn, white knows what he needs to do. Whenever your opponent has an isolated pawn, trade minor pieces to limit activity and gang up on that little guy. Vladimir Kramnik said in this position he felt that already it was clear, especially after bishop d4, that... sorry, MVL just said something to me on Skype. It looks like we have some updates to his analysis, but we'll get to that in a moment. Kramnik said, and I agree, that white just seems to already have a strategically much better game here. It doesn't mean that black has lost at all, and Hikaru played pretty well. It seemed like he was holding. But just from, if you're evaluating what happened out of the opening, which is really important for players at this level in regards to preparation, white has all the cards. White has control over all the squares around the pawn, which is critical when evaluating whether an IQP has been a success. Black has no real clear plan, and I think white can look to either trade or increase pressure on the pawn. What's interesting is, with all that said, Hikaru calculated concretely and took kind of an aggressive plan. He simplified one rook and then looked to simplify a little bit more. And what was funny is after the one more trade of rooks, we got to this position where if Hikaru hadn't gone for this blunder, which I already said was just kind of unnecessary and had a miscalculation, it seems like he's doing okay. He said himself that he thought after knight takes d4 and just trade. Is he really that much worse here? He is, for sure. This bishop being blocked in by the pawns is worse than the counterpart. But it doesn't seem like black doesn't have at least decent drawing chances here. And so Hikaru, critical of himself, said he didn't understand why he didn't just go for the simple thing. But as we said, it was a miscalculation, and the blunder is based on exactly what you're about to see now. Quiescence error, as Alex Lenderman would say, which are some videos on Chess.com you could check out. It means that when you calculate a whole line, you just stop like one move short. And sometimes that happens when you're not appreciating all your weaknesses in the position. With these guys, it's not that basic of a mistake. He just blundered. It was just a miscalculation. Bad day. Not in top form that day. But a quiescence error is something you can learn for yourself as a thing that happens when you're not pushing yourself. Try to always consider your opponent's move as the last move in a variation. It's a tip that I got from a grandmaster that has just been invaluable, and if I ever play chess again, maybe it'll be useful. The point is, how many times do you stop your lines by looking at your move last and deciding, do I like the position I've achieved by this line I've calculated or not? How often do you end your lines with, now, visualizing that position in my head, what's my opponent's next move there? Big difference, and often it's something that even the best players can forget to do. And so he goes for this nice combination that's a win of a pawn and picks up a pony, right? Looks like black just won a pawn, but hey, rook c7, and just like that, you're in Forktown. Can't defend the bishop and the threat of checkmate at once, and that's exactly what Hikaru missed. A very forced combination, and black has simply lost. He loses the bishop. We get a few tactics for a few more moves because, out of frustration, I think Hikaru wanted to play on, but it was the blunder of knight takes g3, so far heard round the candidates' world, and sad for the American, good for the Russian. With that, we move on to our final review, our game of the day between Caruana and Mr. Anish Giri of the Netherlands. And once again, before we jump into the game of the day, credit must be given where credit is due, of course, to Maxime Vachier-Lagrave for his tireless work, attempting to get to the bottom of what was a really complicated game between Fabiano and Anish. I'm not going to go too slowly at all through the opening, because if you want to see more of what I had to say about this line in the Berlin, you can check out yesterday's video where Veselin Topalov played the black pieces against Vishy Anand. But after the same line being reached, once again, we have exactly the same position up till here, where Anand played the move a4. Fabiano plays the move that is the more common one, and that is, of course, queen to b3. Now, after d5, e5, knight d7, this position has been reached many times. In fact, MVL noted that Fabiano reached the black side of this position himself against Topalov not too long ago. So this is a theoretical debate right now, and I say that because fans shouldn't be surprised if we see this position again. These lines offer dynamic chances for both sides, and that's what these players want when they're trying to win and earn the right to play the world champion. MVL, I'm not going to go into all that he says, but he makes an interesting point here, and I'm going to refer to it especially because we spent time analyzing the A4 idea yesterday in Vishy Anand's game. He points out that after A4, A5, and then Queen D1, we could get similar positions to what we end up having in the game, but it shouldn't be underestimated the hidden details behind these moves, as he said, because there are many lines where maybe the bishop on b6 will lack protection once this pawn has been moved because this guy will move. There are also lines where the fact that black has more control over the b4 square is critical. There's all kinds of interesting little things that can happen here, and that's, I think, why I'm sure we're going to see this position again, because it's rich of little details that might throw somebody off if you find something that maybe they underestimated about that. But Caruana didn't. He played queen to d1, and here black played f6. Noted by Maxime is that black has a lot of options here. We're not going to get into all of them. Of course, you can check out his analysis in Peter's news report if you want to know it. He even makes a comment, maybe black has too many options, and that's part of the problem. But after f6, e6, and then knight to b8, we have a position that is not going to be boring. White has an early established pass pawn on the 6th rank, right? That's pretty far. But it's also a potential target. And white has neglected still to this point finishing the development of the queen side. Black is going to try to bring pressure to the d4 pawn. That's part of the relocation here. This is an interesting and rich position. I encourage everyone to check out Maxime's analysis. Knight to b3, queen to b6, and then g4. These are all sort of typical moves. And after the move bishop g6, knight h4, here we reach our first moment where if Anish didn't like the position he got in the game after Fabiano's series of a couple really good moves, probably he needs to play what MVL recommended, which is bishop to e4 immediately. And the idea is that you end up forcing white's hand to kind of come back and get rid of this really strong piece. Note, of course, that f3 to get rid of the piece is not even an option because, oops, black just has queen to g3 check, and that's pretty good for black. So maybe bishop e4 was a move for Giri, but without going into all of it, I'm gonna jump into why. You see, he played the move knight b to c6. What could seem more natural? And Fabiano shocked everybody by going out of his way without thinking to voluntarily give up the bishop pair. Right? This must have been a home-cooked recipe because nobody just wakes up and decides it's nice to part with the bishop pair in a potentially very open position for no real reason. But after bishop takes c6, we see there's not really any good choices for black. B takes c6 it would be a question mark move after the nice idea knight to g2 followed by bishop f4, and actually with the double pawns and white's access he's gaining to dark squares, black is positionally much worse and probably doomed to just blockade this e6 pawn for the rest of the game. So B takes c6 is not really an option. Knight takes c6 is hardly an option either because of the move potentially knight to f5, which after bishop takes f5, g takes f5, again, it seems hard for black to be able to undermine the strength of this really powerful pawn. So in the game, Giri played what seemed to be best, which is queen takes c6. But now after bishop to d2, white ends up gaining tempos on this critical c file, which kind of gives Fabiano some of the pushing cards for a while. There's a lot of complications in the analysis that Maxime provided, and I encourage the more advanced players, especially if you have any interest in this line, to really dive into MVL's analysis because he's really being very honest, not holding anything back, despite the fact that he'll be playing these players probably in these positions at some point in the near future. He actually spends time analyzing bishop f4 with a similar idea to bring the rook to c1, but maybe a slightly more aggressive development. He gives one really interesting line after bishop c2, queen d2. I'm going to make the moves to show just how fun this position might have been if Giri was aggressive. After this g5 move, white could have just sacked, traded, and as MVL said it, these pawns might just have a party of their own at black's expense. That could have been a very interesting position where probably white's just winning. So likely that idea with bishop c2 and g5 wouldn't have been that accurate for Giri anyway. Again, Maxime notes that probably bishop e4 is more accurate and the game is still going to be a little bit of a mess, but that might have been another way for Fabiano to play. So after queen takes c6, he played the move bishop to d2. And we continue with bishop to c2. Again, bishop e4 is interesting. Definitely take a look at it and look at Maxime's analysis. Queen to c2 takes b3 and takes d4. Basically, Giri decides it's worth the risk to take the pawn and get something for this really powerful e6 pawn here. But after bishop to b4 and bishop c5, we have a position where every single move needs to be really accurate. In this moment, maybe Caruana chose the wrong rook to go and pin the bishop. I believe it was Magnus Carlsen, but one of the world champions said that perhaps rook a to c1 was more accurate by Fabiano, with the idea being that yes, he doesn't get to regain his pawn immediately, but with both the queen and rook supporting the c6 pawn, it's really hard to see moves for black over the next series of just natural attacking moves by white. If we analyze it, knight takes f5, and if you try to put pieces here, white might be able to focus on targeting these pawns more slowly and have kept the support of the c-pawn, rather than what we saw in the game where Fabiano's pieces got a little bit distracted on the queen side, and Giri was able to find counterplay. Hard to criticize him because it is very nice to want to go get the pawn back. So here's what happened in the game. Rook e to c1, and after takes and bake, we're going to see that Fabiano did win back the pawn. But I think as of this moment, with rook f to e8, this was really Fabiano's last chance to establish an advantage if there was ever going to be one from this whole line. In this position, he played the move queen to b5, which was a mistake, at least as far as MVL's analysis goes and what we've looked at. The move instead, perhaps the move rook a to c6 instead of queen to b5, neglecting not to go for the endgame, might have been the right way to continue pressure. Some lines that we have here go rook a to c8, e7. Of course, there's an immediate threat of queen to e6 check, so black has to stop it. But here comes g5, undermining the knight and sacrificing the exchange. And this looks like a mating attack that I would not be happy to defend as black. So not exactly sure if all those lines were forced for black, but it does seem that Fabiano either overestimated his endgame chances or underestimated the potential of his attack and this exchange sacrifice, because he doesn't get the pressure he really wants in the endgame when he plays the move queen to b5. So after the move queen to b5 was played, we get a trade, and then Giri finds exactly the counterplay he needs to defend actively. We all know from Dvoretsky, you don't defend worst endgames, especially rook and knight endgames, by bunkering down. Got to look for activity, and Giri plays the exclam d4. He knows it's time to give these rooks their own trouble dealing with a passed pawn, and I think that pretty much saved the game. Some moves continue here just to show the exchanges, and once white is committed to defending this pawn just as much as black had to defend e6, I think the game was pretty much doomed for a draw. Further simplification showed that that's exactly what we were headed toward, and after rook e2, they just agreed because e6 is going to be traded for d2, and neither side will have enough. So this was exciting, and that's why it was chosen as our game of the day over the only decisive result, that being Karjakin's win over Nakamura. And again, mainly because two reasons. MVL and I agreed beforehand it should be the game of the day. One, I think it was the most exciting game. Nakamura's game was really just a big blunder. And two, I think that it may end up having the most theoretical relevance as the tournament goes on. We've now seen this line played twice. I'm going to guess we're going to see it again. Fabiano misses his chance here, really, with by not playing for more pressure in the middle game, rather than offering the queen trade with queen to b5, and there you go. That was a big reason why the game was eventually a draw. So if you want to check out more of Maxim's analysis, please do so at chess.com/news. Make sure you stay tuned for all the videos coming at you daily, highlight videos from the candidates tournament as we cover them. The videos are available both on YouTube, if this is where you're watching it, but also on chess.com. Why might you want to watch it on chess.com? That's because we have all the PGN analysis that Maxim and I are doing right after and as the games are going available for you to download. So not just the game review itself with no analysis, but you can get access to those comments, and if you wish, save them for yourself, maybe even add to it, right? Everyone has their own personal engine these days. So watching the video at chess.com, on the right side, you'll see there's a little download link to get the PGNs, and I encourage everybody to do that. Otherwise, stay tuned, follow the candidates' action, and I appreciate you watching. We will see you around on chess.com.